Welcome to the second part of my conversation with Bas Groes on Han Kang's The Vegetarian. In this part, we discuss the notion of posthumanism, the novel's engagement with South Korean history, and Han Kang's Nobel Prize. If you haven't watched or listened to part one, I do suggest doing that first, and if you're enjoying the content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Welcome back to my conversation with Bas Groes about Han Kang's The Vegetarian. If you didn't catch the first part, I do suggest you check that out first. So we've covered a lot of ground already, and as you mentioned towards the end of the first section, we talked mainly so far about the novel in maybe slightly abstract terms, and we'll bring South Korea and particular historical events in just a moment. First, I did want to touch on one more kind of broad theoretical perspective, which is, as you mentioned already, in the later stages of the novel, Young Hai actually seems to want to become a plant. You've worked a lot on the idea of posthumanism. So could you explain in simple terms what we mean by this term? Also, does the vegetarian fit within this concept, or is it something else?
Yes. To start off with, I don't think it actually, well, it partly fits posthumanism, but posthumanism is really the idea that on the one hand, the ideological underpinnings of humanism and the way we framed what it means to be human and the idea that the human is central to our universe is maybe obsolete. We are now including rocks and nature and plants and trees into our consciousness, in our conscious experience. We attribute some sort of consciousness to inanimate matter. We also understand, of course, that animals have much more kind of consciousness, but also a language that we didn't know before, which is probably quite upsetting for the way we have been treating animals since the dawn of mankind. And there is also, of course, the digital revolution, scientific revolutions, whereby, for instance, AI and robotics are also kind of encroaching on taking over what the human is for, thinking, labor, etc. So, in that sense, maybe the central position of the human, as it were, should be rethought. It has been rethought for a long time. And of course, you could maybe think about a vegetarian as speaking to that process. Is this a post-humanist novel that kind of thinks about the fact that we should be kinder to nature, to animals? It does on the one hand, I think. Um, but what I think is actually happening in the vegetarian is, rather than seeking a sort of transcendence that is forward pushing, what's happening is that the protagonist is trying to achieve a certain non-conscious cognition. So maybe rejecting consciousness and I don't know, the way it's associated with human thought, rejecting human thought by reducing her thinking and her activity to a lower level. And over the past 20-25 years, that has been theorized as well, looking at non-conscious cognition, which happens at a lower part of the brain, whereby there is no necessarily kind of an autobiographical identification of oneself, but it's just a base state of being. And I guess one way of reading what's happening in the novel is trying to achieve that by switching off certain parts of the human experience and thinking and etc., and becoming plant-like, as it were. She doesn't want to become a plant, but plant-like, I think. So,
Mm.
so in that sense, it's not so much for me about postmodernism; it's about non-humanism and accepting maybe that if we try to achieve that state, that will also give us a sense of pleasure, or maybe happiness, contentedness, being at one with the universe, shall we say. So I think maybe that's one way of reframing the novel as well.
Okay. Um, and I guess to bring in one of the aspects I mentioned earlier, which is the fact that nobody around her, the other humans in the novel, don't in any way accept what she's trying to do. Firstly, in terms of her dietary choice not to eat meat, and then later, in a more extreme behavior where she seems to want to become plant-like, to say the least. So, and I want to take us back now to the specifics. In the last part, I talked about sort of concrete, realistic aspects of it. For the most part, the novel's set very squarely in contemporary South Korea, or nearly contemporary. It's not written right now. It doesn't take in much in the way of history or other issues, not directly. So, we recognize this setting as being South Korea, but it's not sort of referring to specifics a lot of the time. One exception to this is something you mentioned. It's a reference to the May Massacre, which is also known as the Gwangju Uprising, which, as you noted in the last section, the military violence violently suppressed student protests against a coup d'etat in 1980. So, either with reference to that particular incident or more generally, to what extent do you think Korean history informs the novel? And, I think to a Westerner who's, I spent a year in Korea actually, but I still feel not particularly familiar or embedded in that culture. The other big event, of course, we think about is the Korean War. In fact, that we have now have two countries, right? That's not really referenced at all. To what extent do these inform the novel? Are they sitting there implicitly? Do they come in subtle ways? How do you understand this relationship?
I'm not an expert, I must say. So, like I said, I read bits and pieces. I stumble serendipitously onto lovely pieces of literature, but um, I've tried to read up, of course, when I look at novels and when I have a deep interest in writers. So, and that becomes maybe a problem because then you start to read the background into novels, and I guess why The Vegetarian has become quite a success is maybe because it actually isn't that explicit about that
Mm,
historical context about the massacre. Um, it does seem to me um, that it's easier to connect it to maybe feminist politics in Southeast Asia, the Me Too movement, or thinking about sort of what I think has been particularly in the East, in Japan, for instance, and I'll say something more about that later, perhaps. Um, whereby women are really kind of are growing in terms of their consciousness and taking to the streets. And in that sense, I think you can read this as more of a metaphor for those politics rather than historical
mm,
politics. Um, Having said all that, of course, the very kind of deep connection with the body, with the violence that we inflict on our bodies, on animals, etc. There is this, I would almost say, an unconscious or yeah, non-conscious layer in the book where that violence is felt through, it filters through into the reader's mind, as it were, and you feel that maybe it isn't a historically specific war that is being represented, but it is at the heart this brutal kind of violent state of human life, of the history of humankind that has been, I don't know, dotted with war, with violence, with bloodshed, and I think that is coming through. So and there are maybe some tiny references to the actual May 18th uprising and the massacre, basically. But I think and this is maybe if you want to talk about the Nobel Prize and
Mm,
this is, I think, she really goes back to investigating what it's like to be a human being, the human experience. That really comes through in the most horrific way. I mean, it is a brutal book, I think, and just to go back to maybe something we haven't discussed, which is maybe the literariness of this book, and even though it is brutal, it's nasty. Um, on almost every page, I get these pinpricks, whereby one
mm,
sentence is deeply, deeply troubling about how people um, think about other people, how they respond to other people, um, from I don't know, um, casual sexual violence, which isn't really noticed by the men, and even when Jin Young's husband, when he needs to take her to hospital, he needs to stop to change his shoes rather than having on the wrong shoes to take her to hospital. So it
mm,
those incidents are deeply, deeply troubling about the way in which people react to one another, how they relate to one another, and that is, I think, why this novel is such a I don't know, it's a, it's both a terrible kind of experience because you get dragged down into the ways in which humans really um, treat one another really, really badly. But also, there still is this kind of hope towards the end, I think.
mm.
Maybe. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it strikes me, you know, these big historical reference, 1980 or the Korean War are violent events, and they're not particularly present in the text at all. But yeah, one thing it does point to is the pervasiveness of violence in other ways. The fact that we're eating meat
Mm,
all the time, but as you've just said, the way we treat each other. And again, I think there is certainly a strong gendered aspect to that, um, with the sexual violence that you mentioned as well.
mm, mm, mm,
Let's touch on the Nobel Prize. Well, not just touch on it. Let's address it because, of course, she'd won the Nobel Prize last year, 2024. Um, it's awarded to an author who, quote, in the field of literature, produced the most outstanding work in an idealistic direction. And it tends to be awarded on the basis of a writer's whole body of work, rather than a single novel, though, we could I suspect that often a single novel probably maybe gets them over the line. I'm thinking of Ishiguro, as well. Never Let Me Go, and was probably, you know, I'm speculating. It's his 20th anniversary of Never Let Me Go, and I've just reread it, so it's on my mind. Um, what would you say about Han Kang's writing that's made her worthy of the Nobel? And always was a slight skepticism that this is a committee who's made this decision. Um, and with that, I guess implicitly is a recognition that her work does have a broad appeal. And when we were discussing by email, doing this, we did talk about the
mm,
fact that okay, we've got two white male Europeans talking about a female Korean writer. And as you've acknowledged, and as I have, we're not experts on Korean history. We're not in that position. So, how does the sort of implicit recognition that her work does have wide appeal, and the fact that people are reading it from very different backgrounds, how do you think these all play out as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? And you can become very self-conscious about I don't know, your own position in the world and your background. But I think, I mean, at the heart of why writers gain a Nobel Prize is that they explore the human condition in all its facets, in refined language, and that has been the main thrust, I think, in the past. There is, of course, a whole history of particular groups, white male writers, who, of course, have been awarded the Nobel Prize. Um, the committee itself has obviously been in some trouble about their own kind of behavior, and I think I'm very glad to see that they're opening up um, their own perspective on what is inclusive. And you mentioned Ishiguro, and of course it was also the Berry Giant, which got him the Nobel Prize, I think, because
Mm.
throughout his work, um, he it's all about human injustice in specific societies, repression of the human spirit. And in the past few years, the Nobel Prize has awarded it in more diverse, inclusive ways, shall we say? But Han Kang's work fits the bill perfectly. It's all about understanding the human condition, and also thinking about how can we make life a little bit better? How can we make the world a little bit better? This is what she has been addressing in her work, sometimes in more political, explicit ways, and in this case, in the vegetarian, um, less implicit, I think, but still there is this deeply human thrust, I think. Um, that I don't like to use the word worthy, but she's completely worthy of the Nobel Prize, I think. So yeah.
Mm. Do you think we just mentioned Ishiguro, and he's talked about the translatability of his work? Um, he writes in anticipation of it being translated. And of course, at
Yep.
his stage in his career, he knows this is going to happen. Do you get the sense Han Kang, and I don't know if you've read on, you mentioned the interview before, is she similarly working in the knowledge that she's now an international writer, or do you think this type of writing is just what she produces and this happens to kind of fit in with this international award culture?
Maybe we should be more skeptical of that. But of course, the vegetarian fits the bill. It is translatable. As you were saying, there's no cultural specificity in a way, except for the use of mobile phones, and maybe some references to certain foodstuffs, etc. Human Acts is more directly about that May 18th massacre that we talked about, so maybe less translatable, or maybe more alien for other readers, as it were. So in that sense, there is a mix here, I think. And yeah, so what I think, by awarding that prize to Kang, maybe the kind of committee also sets us a task to kind of immerse ourselves in different cultures, to understand different nations. And this is also, of course, and this is why I mentioned Ishiguro and the Berry Giant in his Nobel Prize. He went out of his way to kind of call out publishers and writers and agents, etc., um, to widen their kind of conception of what is literature, who produces literature, to
Mm.
be more inclusive, because he says the new exciting voices are likely to not be found in the West. So we need to have that kind of transcultural, transnational view, to be more inclusive. And at the moment, we need it more than ever.
I think that the note you finish on kind of nicely sort of captures the what we talked about at the end of the first section. The need to keep trying against
Mm,
against a background where it seems that this is hopeless. But I think just to finish on a positive note. I mean, I think
mm.
I saw a statistic somewhere recently that young people in particular. I don't know if it was in the UK or in English speaking countries, it might have been the UK, are reading an awful lot of work in translation,
Mm,
which is encouraging, and that, there is an appetite there, and there are translators there who are capable of doing it, and some very good,
mm.
some of the major publishers are doing it, some very good smaller publishers as well. So that at least is a positive sign, I guess.
Absolutely, and also kudos to Deborah Smith, who translated this novel. It's really an excellent job. I mean, I'm a Dutch person, so I read in translation, and I thought, really attentive detail to, on the one hand, um, yeah, capturing that alienating kind of sense that the book is trying to convey, but
Mm,
also making it a very kind of strong read, as it were. So,
mm.
um, and we need to kind of pay attention to the role of the translator as well. But yeah, we need to read outside of our box. We need to read inclusively outside of our normal diet, and that I think is what this novel is also a metaphor for.
Yeah, and good point to acknowledge the role of translators, often not really acknowledged. And I know I've been guilty of doing it as well. Well, thank you so much for your comments. We'll come back in part 3 for your recommendations. So please, everybody, do join us for that. And yeah, thanks again for a great discussion on The Vegetarian.